The restaurant was called Bellecourt, and it had those chandeliers that cost more than a car, the kind that drip crystal in long teardrops from 30-foot ceilings and make everyone underneath them feel temporarily important. My aunt had rented the private dining room for 60 people. White tablecloths. Engraved menus. A string quartet in the corner playing something European and tasteful. My cousin Marcus was getting engaged, and the whole extended family had gathered from 4 states to celebrate, which meant my mother had an audience she hadn't had in years, and she was not going to waste it. I had been sitting at the far end of the table for 11 minutes when she started. She didn't build to it. She didn't use alcohol as an excuse, though she'd had 2 glasses of champagne before the salad arrived. She simply turned in her chair, looked down the length of that long white table, and spoke clearly enough that the string quartet paused between movements, and the pause was filled entirely with her voice. "I want to say something about Renata," she said, and 59 heads turned, and my cousin Marcus looked uncomfortable, and my aunt put her fork down. "Since we're all here celebrating what success looks like, I think it's worth acknowledging what it doesn't look like." I kept my hands flat on my thighs under the table. "Renata has no future." She said it the way a doctor reads a chart. Clinical. Certain. She never finished anything in her life. She drifts. She takes government money and she disappears for months, and she can't tell anyone what she does because there is nothing to tell. 34 years old and no career, no home, no accomplishments. I used to make excuses for her. I'm done making excuses. 58 people heard every word. 2 were looking at their plates. The rest were looking at me. I breathed in for 4 counts. Held for 4. Let it out for 4. My hands stayed flat. The string quartet started again. And I thought, in about 45 minutes, someone is going to walk through that door and nothing in this room is ever going to be what my mother thinks it is again. If you've ever had someone dismantle you in front of everyone you share blood with, stay with me. Because what happens next is not what you're expecting. My name is Renata Vos. I am 34 years old. I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, which most people call DevGRU, in a support role I am not at liberty to describe in detail. My official MOS paperwork lists me as a logistics coordinator. My call sign is Latchkey. I have been awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device, a Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, and a classified accommodation I am not permitted to name in any civilian setting. My family thinks I am a mid-level government contractor who processes paperwork at a regional base in Virginia and occasionally travels for administrative conferences. My mother has described my job at 4 separate family gatherings as basically a secretary for the military, and my brother Derek has never once corrected her, which tells you most of what you need to know about Derek. By 28, I already knew exactly how bad it still was. There is a photograph from my high school graduation that my mother did not take. My Aunt Cecile took it, because my mother was in the parking lot on the phone when my name was called, and when I came back down the aisle holding my diploma, I looked up at the bleachers and found my aunt's phone camera instead of my mother's face. In the photo, I am smiling the particular smile of someone who has just decided not to need something. I had a 4.3 weighted GPA. I was the first person from my high school to be accepted to the Naval Academy preparatory program that year. My guidance counselor cried when she told me. She actually cried. She said she had been waiting 8 years to send a student that letter. When I came home that afternoon with the acceptance packet, this thick cream-colored envelope with an eagle embossed in gold, my mother was in the kitchen and Derek was at the table, and I put it down in front of her and I said, "Mom, read this." She read the first paragraph, set it down, said, "Derek, tell her about the tournament." Derek was 15. He had placed 3rd in a regional chess tournament 2 weeks earlier. He had a small laminated certificate. She had it framed. I do not think she meant it as a calculated cruelty. I think she simply did not register my achievement as a category worth celebrating, the way some people look at a sunset and cannot identify what they're feeling as beauty. It was a perceptual gap in her. The tragedy is that it was not a gap she ever tried to fill. The second memory is Christmas, the year I was 21 and home on leave between training rotations. I had been in the water for 9 months, learning to be something very few people ever learn to be, and I came home for 10 days and sat at the Christmas table, and my mother made a toast. She went around the table, and she named what she loved about each person. She named Derek's work ethic. She named my uncle's humor. She named my aunt's cooking. She skipped me entirely, not with cruelty, with absence, the way you skip a line in a song you don't know, and moved on to my grandmother, and I sat there with my wine glass raised and nowhere to put it. And I set it down very quietly, and I finished my dinner, and I did the dishes, and I drove to a gas station parking lot at 10 at night, and I sat there for 40 minutes breathing very carefully, and then I drove back, and I slept, and in the morning I did not mention it. No one else mentioned it either. The third memory is the promotion. Derek was 27 and had been running what he called a private equity consulting firm for about 8 months. He had 3 clients. His revenue that year, which I know because my mother told me in the context of asking me for money to help celebrate it, was $41,000. My mother threw him a dinner party. She made reservations at a restaurant and invited 12 family members, and she gave a speech about how Derek had built something from nothing and proved that intelligence and ambition were in his blood. That same month I had returned from a 16-week deployment in a country I cannot name, during which I had performed 6 render-safe procedures on improvised explosive devices, had sustained a laceration to my left forearm that required 11 stitches from a medic in a forward operating location, and had been recommended for my first Valor decoration. Nobody threw me a dinner party. Nobody knew too. My father has been remarried and living in Phoenix since I was 9 years old. He sends a card on Christmas. It is always a generic card, the kind you buy in a bundle of 25. It never has a personal note. He does not know what I do for a living. I have never tried to tell him. The mission briefing was at 0300, and I had been awake since 0100, which was normal. The location was a stretch of coast in a region where our presence was not publicly acknowledged, and I will refer to it only as the Gulf site, because even in an unclassified context there are people still operating in that area who deserve to go home to their families, and I will not be the thing that complicates that. The device was a complex multi-node RCIED, remote-controlled improvised explosive device, with what our technical intelligence suggested was a dual redundancy trigger system and an anti-handling feature that would initiate if the primary network was disrupted incorrectly. It had been planted in a location where the blast radius would have encompassed a vehicle containing 4 United States personnel and, given the proximity to a local market that opened at 0600, an indeterminate number of civilians. My job was to get to the device before 0600. I got there at 0447. The disarming process took 31 minutes. I will not walk through the procedure in detail, but I will tell you that at the 22-minute mark I found the anti-handling feature in a configuration I had not seen before, a modified variant, assembled by someone who knew what American EOD techs were trained to look for and had deliberately inverted the expected sequence. I stopped. I breathed. For counts in. For held. For out. And I looked at it the way you look at a puzzle that is designed to kill you if you solve it wrong, which means you look at it with complete, still, undivided respect. I solved it right. The 4 personnel who were the target of that device included a chief petty officer named Halvorsen, and a young lieutenant named Carver, and a civilian interpreter named Fadia, and a SEAL team member whose name I am keeping out of this story at his request, but whose face I will be able to describe in detail in about 20 minutes when we get back to Bellecourt. I walked away from that device with a bruised knee from a fall on debris and a small burn on my right wrist from a wire that reacted unexpectedly during the final circuit isolation. Not dangerous, but permanent. The scar is roughly the diameter of a nickel. It looks like a watermark. I was in the debrief vehicle at 0537, which was 23 minutes before the market opened, when my phone connected to the base network and loaded 3 hours of messages. There were 11 texts from my mother. The first 4 were logistical. The 5th one said, "The roof has a leak above the kitchen and 2 roofers quoted us already and Derek says the cheapest was $6,200. We need it by Friday." No question about where I was. No question about whether I was okay. No inquiry about what I had been doing for the past 72 hours. Just the dollar amount and the deadline. I wired $6,400 that afternoon from the forward operating base, sitting on a folding chair with lukewarm water and a plastic bottle and dust in every crease of my uniform, because I gave myself the extra 200 for what I calculated were probably related gutters. I did not tell her what I had done that morning. She did not ask. Let me give you the real numbers, because the real numbers are the only part of the story that is truly difficult for me to say out loud without needing to stop and breathe. Between the ages of 23 and 33, 10 years, I transferred a total of $143,882.17 to my mother's household. I have every bank record. I have every wire transfer receipt. I organized them in a folder in 2022, not because I was planning anything, but because I am trained to document everything, and the habit does not stop when the uniform comes off. The roof was $6,400. A car for Derek was $14,200, which my mother described to the rest of the family as a gift Derek had saved up for himself. A kitchen renovation, granite countertops, new appliances, custom cabinetry, was $31,000 over 2 separate transfers which she had asked for as a loan and which was never repaid, and about which she has never once spoken again. Derek's business expenses, which I later determined were largely meals, one international trip to a conference he claims to have spoken at, and a logo redesign, accounted for another $22,600 across 14 separate requests. There were medical bills. There were utilities during a period my mother described as a cash flow gap. There was a vacation to Cancun that I did not know was a vacation until I saw the Instagram post while I was eating a ramen packet at a shared table in a barracks building at Naval Amphibious Base, Little Creek. During those 10 years, I owned 2 pairs of civilian jeans, one dress I bought at a consignment store in Norfolk for $28, and a pair of boots I resold twice. I ate government food and protein bars and whatever was at the commissary when I had time to get there. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it, and a check engine light I had learned to interpret as a personality trait rather than a warning. My mother's kitchen had heated floors by the time I stopped counting. Derek had a Porsche lease. I had a scar on my wrist that looked like a watermark and a deployment count that I am not authorized to disclose. The math does not require any emotional commentary. It simply is what it is. The party was a Marcus engagement party, as I said, but it was also the occasion my mother had been building toward for years without knowing it. The room was right, the audience was perfect, the chandeliers were expensive enough to make everyone feel that what happened beneath them mattered. She had dressed carefully. A deep blue wrap dress. Hair done. She looked like a woman who had prepared for a performance, which, I understand now, she had. The first hour was fine. I sat near the end of the table and I talked to my Aunt Cecile, who has always been kind to me in the quiet way of people who see more than they say, and I ate my salad and I watched the room and I thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I developed in very loud places. Then the toasts began. Marcus and his fiancée were toasted first, correctly, warmly, with specific stories about their kindness and their love and the way they looked at each other. My aunt cried. The right kind of crying. I lifted my glass genuinely. Then Derek stood up, without being asked, which was characteristic, and he gave a toast about himself framed as a toast about family, which was also characteristic. He talked about building empires and knowing your worth and the people who stand beside you when you're grinding. He mentioned his consulting firm, which had been described to me by my mother as thriving and which I had reason to believe was surviving on a combination of one retained client and a substantial portion of my hazard pay transfers. He mentioned that he was in conversations about a government contracts advisory role, and he used the phrase classified level access in a context that made 2 of my back teeth ache. Then my mother stood up. She talked about Marcus for 45 seconds. She transitioned into a general statement about what success meant to her. She looked down the table at me, and she said what she said. Renata has no future. She drifts. She takes government money. 34 years old and no career, no home, no accomplishments. 58 people heard it. I breathed in for 4 counts. Held for 4. Released for 4. And then the door to the private dining room opened. His name is Commander Joel Reyes, and he was there because my cousin Marcus works at a defense contractor and Joel is a former SEAL who now consults in the private sector, and Marcus had invited him as a professional guest without any knowledge of what that name meant to me or what my name meant to him. The universe does not usually arrange things this neatly. I noted that with something close to wonder. He came through the door in a navy blazer and dark trousers, scanning the room the way people who have spent significant time in dangerous places always scan a room. Entry, exit, threats, friendlies, 3 seconds, cataloged, complete, and I watched his eyes move across the table, and I watched them stop. They stopped on me. His face did something I have seen faces do only a few times, and only in specific circumstances. The blood left it so completely and so fast that the man became gray under the restaurant lighting, gray the way concrete is gray, and his jaw came open by perhaps a centimeter, and he stood absolutely still in the doorway, and his heels, I noticed, came together. Not deliberately. Not a salute. Just the body doing what the body learned to do when it registers a specific category of authority that bypasses all conscious decision-making. Then he said it. His voice cracked on the first word, which it had never done in any context I had previously observed, and I had observed Commander Reyes in some extremely high-pressure contexts. Latchkey. My mother was still standing. She had not finished. She had been about to say something further, something that would have been worse than what she had already said. I could see it in the set of her mouth, and she turned toward the door with the expression of someone annoyed at an interruption. "Young man," she said, "we're in the middle of a family." Joel Reyes walked past the first 3 chairs and stopped at the point of the table nearest to me, and he looked at me, and then he looked at my mother, and then he looked at the room full of people, and I watched him understand the entire situation in approximately 4 seconds, which is about how long Joel Reyes needs to understand most situations. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was controlled now, but something inside it was not controlled. Something below the control was shaking the way a bridge shakes when the frequency is right. "Do you know who this is?" "I know exactly who she is," my mother said. "She is my daughter, and I was speaking." "This woman," Joel Reyes said, and he reached up with his right hand and pressed it flat against his chest, against the left side, over the sternum, and he held it there, and the room was quieter than it had been all night, quieter than the quartet between movements, quieter than anything, and he said, "I am alive because of her." Nobody moved. He did not look away from my mother. On the 14th of March, in a location I'm not going to name, this woman spent 31 minutes alone with a device that should have killed her, and she walked away from it, and because she walked away from it, 4 people went home to their families. I am one of those 4 people. His hand was still on his chest. I went home to my wife. I went home to my daughters. I have 2 daughters now. The younger one is named for a saint, but I considered naming her Latchkey, and my wife said no. There was a fractured half-sound in the room that was almost a laugh, and was not a laugh. Lieutenant Commander Voss has a Bronze Star with Valor. She has a commendation I am not cleared to describe in this setting. She has done things I watched with my own eyes that I still don't entirely know how to explain to people who weren't there. My mother's mouth was open. She looked at me. She told me the sentence didn't have an ending. She told you what she was permitted to tell you, Joel said. Which was less than the truth. The room was looking at me now, and I let them look. I kept my hands on my thighs. I breathed normally. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the particular stillness that comes after a very long tension finally resolves, the stillness that is not peace yet, but is the first shape of it. My mother said, "She never told me any of this." I said 2 words. "You never asked." That night I sat in my rental car in the hotel parking lot, and I opened the banking app. I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters to me. This was not rage. This was not grief. This was what we call deliberate action, the kind of thing you do when the objective has been assessed, the method has been chosen, and emotion has been set aside because emotion is noise and noise gets people hurt. I went to automatic transfers first. There were 7. I canceled the standing monthly transfer of $800 to my mother's household account, which I had set up in 2017 and which she referred to as her stipend, and which I had never once been thanked for. Canceled. I canceled the quarterly transfer of $1,500 that covered Derek's business software subscriptions, his domain renewals, and what my mother described as operational costs, though the operations in question appeared to be primarily his Netflix account and a premium gym membership. Canceled. I canceled the automatic payment for my mother's car insurance. Canceled. The car payment for Derek's Porsche lease that I had been contributing $600 a month toward since 2022. Cancelled. The streaming bundle. Cancelled. The storage unit rental she said held family items and which I had never visited. Cancelled. The monthly transfer to a joint account I had been told was for family emergencies and which had funded a kitchen renovation and a Cancun vacation. Cancelled. 7 transfers. 4 minutes.
No emotion.
Supply line severed. Logistics terminated. Then I composed one email. It was addressed to my mother and Derek. The subject line was 3 words, for your records. The body of the email was 1 sentence. Please find attached. The attachment was a PDF. 31 pages. My unclassified service record, my decoration summary, a letter of commendation from a commanding officer, and the transaction history, every wire transfer, every automatic payment, every dollar, exact to the cent, spanning 10 years and totaling $143,882.17, organized by year, annotated, and formatted the way I format everything, which is to say, clearly, completely, and without any possibility of misunderstanding. I sent it at 11:47 p.m. Then I put the phone in the glove box and I sat in the dark and I breathed, not tactically, just normally, just the way a person breathes when they are finished with something. Weapons free. Derek's Porsche payment processed for the last time on a Tuesday. The following Tuesday it did not process, and the Tuesday after that the leasing company called, and the Tuesday after that there was a notice, and within 6 weeks the car was gone. I know this because my Aunt Cecile told me, not triumphantly, just factually, in the way she relays information to me, as someone who she understands needs accurate field reports. The business. Derek had been invoicing one client, and had been using my transfers to cover overhead while representing to that client that he ran a functioning firm with multiple associates. When the transfers stopped, the overhead collapsed, and when the overhead collapsed, the fiction collapsed with it, and the client, who had been close to signing an expanded contract, discovered that the team Derek had described consisted of Derek and a freelance graphic designer he had hired twice on Fiverr. The contract did not happen. The client did not renew. The kitchen renovation had been financed partially on a credit line my mother had taken out in 2021, which the monthly transfers had been servicing. When those stopped, the minimum payments did not get made. When the minimum payments did not get made, the card was suspended. I have a second-hand account, again from Cecile, who is my most reliable intelligence source on this front, that my mother's card was declined at the grocery store. A full cart. 3 people behind her in line. She called me 4 days after the email. She called from a number I recognized, and I let it ring twice, and then I answered. She said, "Renata, I want you to know that I didn't mean what I said the way it sounded, and I think we need to talk about this like adults." I said, "I know what you meant." Silence. I said, "I hope you and Derek figured out." I hung up. She has called twice more since then. I have not answered. I have read the texts which have moved through several phases, initial outrage, then something resembling an apology that was primarily about consequences rather than comprehension, then a longer message about family and forgiveness that I read once and archived. I have not responded to any of them. 6 weeks after Bellecourt, I took 3 weeks of leave, the first uninterrupted leave I had taken in 4 years, and I drove to the Oregon coast. I want to tell you about this part carefully because this is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't spent years compressing themselves into the amount of space other people were willing to give them. I rented a small house 20 yards from the water. It had a propane fireplace and a kitchen with a window that faced west, and a bed with more pillows than I had owned in aggregate in the previous decade. I paid for it entirely with my own money, which I have always had more of than anyone in my family understood, because I never spent it on myself. The payment did not cause me anxiety. It caused me something I needed a day to identify, and the word I eventually found was permission. I cooked for myself every night. Not ramen. Not whatever was fastest. I went to the farmer's market on the first Saturday, and I bought vegetables and a piece of salmon and some bread from a bakery that was still warm when I carried it to the car, and I made a meal that took an hour, and I ate it at the table looking at the water, and I did not rush, and no one needed anything from me. I walked on the beach every morning. My wrist scar was visible because I rolled my sleeves up and I looked at it sometimes, not with sadness, just with the recognition you give to evidence. It happened. I was there.
He chose correctly.
The scar is not a wound anymore. It is a record. One afternoon I sat on the porch with coffee, and I thought about my mother, and I want to be honest about what that thinking was and was not. It was not fantasizing about her suffering. It was not satisfaction about the Porsche or the credit card or the store. It was something more tired than that and more clear. It was the recognition that she had been given for 10 years, the chance to ask one question. One question. Are you okay? Are you safe? What are you doing out there? And the question was never asked, not once, not in any form, not with genuine curiosity or even with the reflexive concern of someone going through the motions of love. She did not ask because she did not believe there was anything worth asking about. And I had believed her, at some low register, for a long time. Long enough that I kept sending money as though money could prove something that words hadn't been able to prove, as though eventually the deposits would add up to visibility. They did not. The last evening of my leave I sat outside until it was fully dark, and then I went inside, and I made tea, and I sat by the propane fire, and I thought about a line I heard years ago from an old Master Chief who had done more deployments than I had years in service, a man with hands that looked like topographic maps and eyes that had arrived at some permanent equanimity. He told me once, "The enemy will always exploit an open supply line. The discipline is knowing when to close it." He was talking about something tactical. He was talking about something else too. I don't carry what happened at Bellecourt as a victory. I don't describe what I did with the banking app as revenge. The enemy is not my mother. The enemy was never my mother. The enemy was the story I had been told about who I was and what I was worth, and I carried that story for a long time, and I gave it resources I should have kept, and one evening in a hotel parking lot in the dark, I finally closed the supply line. Not in anger. In clarity. If this story reached something in you, if you have been sending resources to people who cannot see you, if you have been invisible in the rooms that should see you clearest, I hope something in these words is useful. Not as instruction. Just as evidence that the clarity is available, that the stillness on the other side of it is real. Thank you for being here. If you stayed through all of it, please like and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and I will keep telling them for as long as they need to be told.